Okay, folks. Well, here we go. 2020, 2021, our COVID 19 catastrophe or creativity conundrum. The world is different, and I suppose we can decide whether it's going to be a conflagration, like we see on the left, or a time of growth that we see on the right. What we do is going to determine how things go. Um, let's put everything into perspective. There's nothing with more research backing what we are needing to do going forward than Maslow's hierarchy of motivations. His theory of human motivation, coming from 1943, was an inversion of the Siksika Blackfoot tribe of, well, we'll just say Washington, southern Canada, southwestern Canada, where self-actualization, the finding of self, community, finding of community, and then going and continuing on through, meeting physiological needs and safety needs is at the top. Well, that's on the right. Now, Maslow in 1943, again, we have 77 years and over 3 dozen fields, most of the medical fields, that agree that Maslow's hierarchy is essentially correct. On the left, we inverted that because we have to be reminded to care for our children in the West. But that being said, this is our actual new text. This is our context. This is not to say that we are not going to use, traditional textbooks or novels or reading or writing of any sort. That is stupid. Nobody's suggesting that. You can't have school without content. But what it is suggesting is that we are now in a very new context, and the texts have changed along with it. So, what we do know is that instability in 2021 is going to be rampant. We're unlikely to have the stability that we're used to when we do school. Okay? Just imagine. Let's say we go back at some point physically. I still am working under the impression that we're not going to go back physically. But let's say we at some point do. Um, so we teach 2 days a week. I teach Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday I meet online, and then Thursday I come down with mild symptoms of COVID-19, and it turns out I get tested and I had it. And what that means is that the kids and the families I taught on Monday and Tuesday, and any kids I might have worked with on Thursday, all must be quarantined for at least 10 days. Okay? But then, these kids go home to their families, grandparents, parents, and other senior siblings. Those kids are now people who have been exposed to COVID, and those kids have to be taken out of the general population, and maybe even the classrooms at the elementary schools and the high schools of the kids who got connected to that have to go on shutdown. So we are all winging it here. It has been at least 3 generations, 2 to 3 generations, excuse me, since we have had to deal with this kind of global pandemic with these kinds of viruses. We have grown like a little tiny yappy dog in an apartment complex. We have not grown our ability to be in the forest. We have grown our ability to be in a little apartment and to sit on the little laps of our owners and enjoy the attention and the little treats. But we have not been used to this kind of thing. When 2 or 3 generations ago, there would at least be some context. So the only thing we know for sure is there's going to be no stability this year, which means we have to produce, provide, or cultivate our own abilities to, well, be resilient. What we do know is that our kids, in a variety of ways, due to economic, primarily, social, secondary, or maybe social primary, economic secondary. And then, of course, the existential crisis of COVID and the change of normalcy and the desire to go back to normalcy, which is not going to ever happen. This is a new world, and we must act appropriately. But to ignore the fact that our kids are going home and are now used to increased screen time, increased social screen time, there's a mess inside their heads, and for us to ignore those and just to move what we used to be doing online is not only arguably very unethical choice, but an ineffective one. Again, the context the lives of our children are leading have changed, and for us not to adapt to that, well, it's foolish. So let's talk about where our kids are at. They have PTS, because I don't believe PTSD. It's not post traumatic stress disorder. The body is sending 8 pieces of information into the mind for every 2 pieces of information the mind sends into the body. And so when we have a traumatic event and we encode it and we have flashbacks or we have trauma, our body isn't disordered. It isn't doing something it's not designed to do. Our bodies have memory systems. You can take somebody with absolute, unquestionable loss of short-term memory, somebody who's never played, let's say, the game Tetris before, and teach them how to play Tetris. And the next day you tell them, hey, I'm going to teach you how to learn. I'm going to learn you how to do Tetris, and they won't know what it is. But once their hands touch the controller, and once they start to experience the game, they pick it up faster and faster and faster. And those short-term associative memories being built in the hippocampus start to actually re-encode, and you can actually rebuild short-term memory this way. Well, our kids, that all being said, our kids definitely do have post-traumatic stress, and so do we. Every one of us does. It's maybe not the same as losing a limb, or for instance, right now, my wife is in surgery to remove a portion of her anterolateral temporal lobe. Okay. We all have this post-traumatic stress. So in this presentation, which I'm also sending to all of you, I believe these are some interesting and potent resources for us to start to learn how to work with kids who universally do have trauma. Now, some kids will be less traumatized than others, but everyone on the planet has now been touched by this thing. I would have preferred it to be a Prince concert that brought us all together, but it turns out COVID-19 has done it for us in a very different way. So, what we really have to start asking ourselves when we are deciding how to schedule and how to create our classroom digitally or physically, what we have to really start to do is how can we as an institution and how can we as individual human beings become a stabilizing force? What we do collectively as an institution and what we do collectively in our teams and what we do with our kids and what they do collectively together is going to matter. Because if we are not a stabilizing force, if we are adding more difficulty to their lives, we're only going to further stigmatize school in their minds and in the minds of their families, and then eventually in the minds of their children. And I'm not close enough to retirement to where I can say I don't have anything to do with that, because the kids I'm going to be teaching this year, I will teach their kids. Well, that's the plan. And so we can't count this time on traditional schooling being a stable factor. It's just not. Even if unless we go full digital the full year and don't try to go back and forth willy-nilly, this is going to be a tough year. So what can we be more consistent with? Well, the things that are guaranteed to be consistent in a kid's life, relatively speaking, are home, family, neighborhood, and community. That's the thing. When you actually total up the number of minutes that kids are spending in class every year, and assume that they make the time to have 8 hours of sleep a night, which we all know they don't. They use less of their time to sleep than 8 hours a night. You actually find out that kids only spend 17% at most of their time in a classroom every year. And the rest of the 83% of their waking hours is spent at home, family, neighborhood, and community. So our greatest natural resource that I'm sure many of us are using, and if not, there's always tomorrow, or even better, today, is the home, family, neighborhood, and community. These are the greatest natural resources we have at our disposal as pedagogues, and hopefully we make use of those more so in this school year than in years before. And I think, in my personal experience, that once you privilege home, family, neighborhood, and community, the content we are responsible for disseminating as members of the state. We are people that are employed by the state to indoctrinate the kids with certain ideas and concepts and skills. Let's make no bones about it. It is an indoctrination. And I don't know about you guys, but being indoctrinated to wipe my own bottom, definitely a plus. So indoctrination is not always bad, but again, you've got this system of home, family, neighborhood, and community going on, indoctrinating them anyway. We might as well utilize all of that life experience so that they can find meaning and construct meaning on their own of the content we're trying to give them. That being said, it's nothing new. If we aren't already doing it, there's nothing new. There's this trifecta of COVID, climate change, and capitalism's lament. We can't afford to ignore this. If we were ignoring it, it's not great, but we can't afford to continue. So what I'm suggesting is that our content lenses as a school, as teams, and as individual teachers can and should be brought to bear on the symptoms of these problems. Again, COVID-19, climate change, and capitalism's lament. All three of these are going to have long-term, powerful transformative aspects on our civilization, our culture, our communities, and our kids. And so we don't want to do this haphazardly. We don't want to be willy-nilly or fliffy-flaffy about it. If we do, we are really in danger of reverting. If we are in danger of reverting to our traditional way of doing things, we will inadvertently, or maybe on purpose, add additional stability to the lives of these children. We will further stigmatize school. I've said it now twice. We cannot afford to do that. We need to be learning new things. We need to be learning about complex systems. We need to be learning about adaptability in history so that we can exhibit such adaptability in the years to come. Otherwise, we might as well kiss the species adios already. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not willing to do that yet. So what we have to do is really include frameworks and philosophies that positively, immediately, and materially impact our students' lives. That is how they're going to engage with the content we are tasked with indoctrinating them with. Okay? Again, indoctrination not being a bad thing. Teaching a kid to raise their hand, good indoctrination. Teaching them to use the restroom appropriately, pretty good indoctrination as well. So what this all comes down to is that our kids are the curricula. And once we start really focusing on that, their, again, hierarchy of motivations, understanding their trauma, understanding, family, community, and beyond, and our place within it, all of that, that is the curricula. Our kids are the curricula. So how do we do this pragmatically? All of this is great and theoretical. First, you need a concept. It's called a generative theme. And I'll just read off the page. A generative theme is a concrete, in other words, easily understood, lens and mirror, a representation of our epoch, a representation of our reality. That's what a generative theme is. Okay? Now, generative themes are used to anchor different content areas to larger concepts. And so let's talk about what an epoch is so this the whole definition can make sense. An epoch in this context is characterized by complex dynamical landscapes of ideas, concepts, hopes, doubts, values, and challenges. It is all of what we are as individuals, which is in constant co-formation with our ever-changing social and physical environments. It is a greater than the sum of its part phenomena, the output of each of us striving together towards our individual sense of fulfillment. You might also call this the zeitgeist. Well, this concept of generative themes comes from Paulo Freire, a Brazilian pedagogist. What my suggestion is that we as teams, we as a school, we as individuals make sure we have conversations about the themes that we are going to be addressing in our maths class, in our science class, in our language arts class, in our social studies class, in our PE class, in our art class. All of these themes can be the tie that binds everything together. Or maybe, if you prefer a different metaphor, the hub of the wheel, the heart of the body. It's that which connects everything together. So these generative themes are a useful and pragmatically useful and demonstrably effective way to approach the stability building that I'm hoping that we engage in as an institution. Again, you don't have to come up with anything new. There's the idea from the International Baccalaureate program called the MYP. I taught in Kobe, Japan, and I found this particular framework to be very useful by looking at global context, universal, if you will, contexts. These students in Japan developed an understanding of their common unity, their community, their common humanity. They shared, they became like guardians of the planet through a developmentally appropriate set of explorations that included, as you can see this on the screen, identities and relationships, personal and cultural expression, orientations in space and time, scientific and technical innovation, fairness and development, and globalization and sustainability. Check it out again. These links are in the presentation. Another example of a generative theme is a simple set of questions. What is a city? Now that seems like a very simple idea, but once you start to unpack what a city is, as Ann Pendleton Julian, of the Santa Fe Institute noted, is that the city is not just buildings at a specific geographical location. It's much more than that. It's a Venn diagram between material infrastructure and environment in both form and function. So there are the material considerations, the environmental considerations, the political and economic and social considerations, the messy ways humans exhibit their lives and fulfill their lives, and then understanding that it's a multiscalar phenomena in that cities are top-down implications of bureaucracy and people pushing back against it through creativity and through the bottom up. And so when you start to unpack what a city really is, as in our adult brains, it's pretty darn complicated. Now imagine being an 11, 12, 13-year-old kid entering the school this year and being asked this question. I don't know about you all, but in my 12 years of teaching, the kids would start off by saying, it's a place where there's a lot of people. Okay, that's great. And that's the point of departure, where kids are ready to start from. And that's where we have to meet them, in this roiling river of technology and trauma, and where we have to help save them from drowning themselves. So, these generative themes are a really important way for us to, to create stability. Our job this year is not even pedagogical, it's stabilizing. Without the stability of co-formational behaviors, what ends up happening is that COVID, climate change, racial social justice, gender justice, all of these things will take precedence without any meaning making. It will become an emotive only or emotive first reality. I don't know about you guys, but I don't like the idea of a bunch of 30-year-olds who are acting 13 running around controlling society and doing all the jobs when I'm 90. I would really not like that. So at this point, you can break off. I'm I have my own frameworks in my head of how all of this fits together, and the generative themes I would use if I was teaching each of these subjects. So from this point, I suggest if you've had your fill of this, move on. Otherwise, continue on. So for me, the major themes of social studies come down to this graphic on the right, which it's a symbol that encapsulates the ideas on the left. Now, on the right, you can see that tiny little piece of the arrow in the middle of the symbol. And what you end up seeing is that that's basically the window we're looking through for each lesson. Okay, so I'm looking at the Spanish-American War, or I'm looking at the Mexican-American War, or I'm looking at the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a tiny little window, a tiny piece of a much larger sky, and that sky being in relation to the Earth and to the surrounding space around Earth, etc., etc. But, my job as a social studies teacher is to look at that little tiny one piece of sky and try to help our kids understand the universality of the story within that tiny window. And as I see it, and only, this madman talking to you now sees it this way, is that really social studies, the study of human society, is about continuity and change, connection, our common unity, our culture, and then colonialism and capitalism. To deny that these are formative, deeply formative aspects of our society today, again, is not only questionable when it comes to ethics, it's ineffective. If we look at all of these five and how they have throughout history and even today repeated themselves iteratively in a form of resistance and resiliency. Resistance fighting against the status quo, and the resiliency in creating stabilizing forces. We are in a point where we're having to resist the old ways of doing things so that we can become a new form of resiliency. That's why I'm saying we cannot afford to ignore the trifecta of capitalism's lament, COVID-19, and climate change. These things are going to be here. They're going to be long term, and for us not to address them would be further destabilizing. So, whatever we can do pedagogically, again, in social studies or any other subject, to talk about these things and then relate them to the content we are tasked with teaching, then I think we stand a better chance of being those stabilizing forces that the kids need. And lastly, deep time. Deep time is like infinities are different sizes. We can look back several billion years, we can look forward several billion years, or we can look back 40 and then predict the next 40. These are the major themes of social studies. I know that traditionally it's looked at as history, civics, government, geography. These are the typical things of social studies, but that's, again, low dimensional. These 7 ideas on this screen right now are very much so connectable to English language arts. They're connected to the conceptuals necessary to truly understand maths. They're really, really useful, again, in science. These are designed to be universal concepts propelling this little yellow ball down a straight line. And so these major themes of social studies, I'm going to be teaching both New Mexico and U.S. history this year. This is going to be my anchor, is these 7 concepts. Okay, the 5 printed on the yellow ball as it rolls down the road of time and of space, so that we may understand how we live today and decide how we will live tomorrow. Now, for maths, I would say that if I was teaching math, I would be focusing in the middle school area on social and historical origins. But that's because I'm a history and language arts person, I'm naturally going to be more interested in the stories. Why did we need to go beyond the counting of too many cattle? Why did we need to develop a place system, a base 60 in the Babylonian context, base 10 in our modern context? Why did we need to do that? Why did we need to invent algebra? Why did Euler's identity need to be developed? How is it used to get astronauts around the Earth and eventually to the Moon and satellites to Pluto? How and why did maths impact our lives? That is, to me, the propellant that we can use to really get kids to engage in the mathematics. But math itself is made up of constancies, structures and relationships, spaces, changes, applied mathematics, and then, of course, analysis, and then optimization and foundational axiomatics. That's you can't. In my mind, you can't make the understanding of mathematics happen without all 7+1 of these ideas. But again, in maths in middle school, my mind, just one mind, is it's absolutely necessary to focus on the social historical origins. The stories propel our understanding of mathematics. Math on its own is not typically interesting to most of our kids, and all you have to do is look at the math scores in almost any high school and middle school in the entire country, and you'll see that it suffers in comparison to the language and historical contexts that we are being tested upon. So, again, this is not really my opinion. It's pretty clear that our kids aren't as engaged in mathematics, and maybe the gateway drug towards getting them to understand and enjoy it is understanding the social and historical origins of everything from the creation of numbers to the formulae that we use, the equations that we use to understand reality. Well, for science, what are the major themes of science? I would suggest that it's a little bit different. Depending on which frame you want to use, I would say that scale, I'm looking at the right, understanding the concept of scale of both space and time is necessary to understand science. Understanding it's all made of information, understanding that there are boundaries within the wholeness, and we have to put boundaries to understand. Otherwise, the wholeness becomes impossible to understand. The interrelationships and intra-relationships defining everything. Equilibria, both attractor and repulsor. Understanding change over time, understanding complex dynamical systems, the energy-matter equivalence, and universal diversity through diverse universality. You can also look at scale, both space and time, thermodynamics, information theory, string theory, quantum and classical physics, chemistry, biology, complex dynamical systems, ecology, astrophysics, and astrobiology. On the left, that's coming from Edward Wilson's or E.O. Wilson's concepts from the book Consilience, and on the right, that's just my own approach. But again, the idea here is that we have unifying themes in our content levels. We have unifying themes in our teams, and we have unifying themes in our grades, and we have unifying themes as a school. Again, why we have to anchor everything we're doing in all classes to certain concepts, unifying all the content areas. Because once we separate the understanding of maths from the understanding of history, we lose out on both. Our idea here is for kids to unify knowledge in their own contexts in the highest utility for them. Language arts, another very simple set of concepts. For me, the major themes in language arts come from neurolinguistics, neuronemonics, and memetics, form and function of language, the fractal meaning making that occurs in how a language as a whole unfolds, the pragmatics and utility, the semantics and creativity, and the culture and tribalism that come together to form our individuated and culturally based, in many cases geographically based language systems. Our linguistic units like morphemes, words, sentences, paragraphs, sections, chapters, books, libraries. The relationship of the writer to the reader and the reader to the writer, the relationship of the writer and the reader to the zeitgeist of the present moment and the pasts that we are all perceiving in the world, the relationship of our past and present understanding to the potential futures, and the integration of ourself with the universally human understanding, to where I can read the Epic of Gilgamesh and understand something about the common day, even though that was written over 4,000 years ago. It can still be a piece of literature to help us understand the world, much as James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time could also be used to help us understand the universal themes. Heck, Harry Potter, whatever you happen to use, Wiz Khalifa, you are really looking to bring human experience into the minds of our readers. And that's what it comes down to. Those are the what I call the core four. The relationships we're talking about are really about finding whether this is going. Well, we're going to be finding. We're going to be determining whether this trifecta of capitalism's lament, climate change, and COVID-19. All of these things, are they going to be catastrophes for our species, or are they going to be moments of creative endeavors? I don't know about you folks, but I'm really hoping for the latter. I'm hoping for more creativity. I'm hoping for life to flourish intellectually, spiritually, physically in this time. You know, I once heard it put, never let go to waste a catastrophe. In the history of this planet, there have been 5, and now we're in the middle of the 6th major set of extinctions, where most of the life on the planet died. And while that was tragic and that was horrible, and it's going to be horrible, it also allowed space to open up for new variation to occur. You see mammals come out of this. You see lizards, reptiles, come out of this. You see amphibial life. You see trees coming out of these catastrophes. All these things that we take for granted as life on this planet came about as a result of catastrophe. So what can we do to tip the scale? We don't have to change the system. We just have to tip the scales to where we're moving more in the creative direction rather than the catastrophic. If we can do that as educators, then not only are we standing on firm ethical ground, we are standing on clearly high utilitarian, highly pragmatic, highly useful grounds. And I don't know about you folks, but I got into this profession not to teach language arts and social studies. I got into this profession to teach people and to learn about myself. And so in my act of creating myself, rather than focusing on the catastrophe of the moment, hopefully what I've talked about here will be of high utility to you, and if not, that's fine too. I'll see you guys on the flip side. Join me, jump into the river with me. The water's fine.